first light comes as a gradual thinning of the dark, a slow change from deep grey to pale grey that seeps around the edges of the wooden shutter. You are not pulled from sleep by any noise or movement, but by the simple fact that the darkness behind your eyelids has grown thin. You open your eyes to the ceiling, a plain surface of lime-washed boards and old beams that run from the window wall to the door. The beams are dark with age, smoothed by the hands of the carpenters who set them in place long before you were born. You lie still for a long time, feeling the weight of the wool blanket across your chest, listening to the quiet that is not quite silence, the small settling sounds of the building, the distant scuff of a bird on the roof tiles, the very far-off hush of the sea breathing against the harbour wall. These sounds are so familiar that you do not really hear them. They are simply the background of your waking, like the texture of the sheet against your chin. The room is small and whitewashed. It contains a narrow bed, a low wooden chest with iron hinges, a washstand with a clay basin and pitcher, and a single stool with a woven rush seat. There is also a nail driven into the wall beside the door, and from this nail hangs your everyday coat, a plain garment of dark blue wool that you wear when the mornings are cool. Now, in this first hour, the air is mild and you feel no urgency to rise. You watch the light grow from grey to silver, and then, very slowly, to a warm honey colour along the upper edge of the shutter where a crack admits the earliest sun. A fine line of gold appears on the wall above the washstand, tracing the shape of the crack like a thread laid across the plaster. It does not move perceptibly, yet over the passing of minutes it lengthens and widens, and you know that the sun has cleared the hills behind the town. At last you push the blanket aside and sit up on the edge of the bed. The rush seat of the stool is rough under your bare feet when you put them down. You stand and stretch your arms upwards, feeling the pleasant pull across your shoulders and the slight stiffness in your lower back from the night's rest. You flex your fingers open and closed several times, working away the faint numbness that always settles in your knuckles after many hours of holding a quill. The floorboards are cool and smooth, worn into shallow valleys along the lines of the grain, and they creak in one familiar spot just beside the bed. You step around that spot without thinking, the way a person avoids a loose stone on a familiar path. At the washstand you lift the clay pitcher with both hands. It is heavy and still cool from the night air. You pour water into the basin, a thin stream that catches the light and makes a soft ringing sound against the unglazed clay. You set the pitcher down, dip your hands into the water, and splash your face once, twice, 3 times, each splash a small shock of cold that draws the sleep fully out of your skin. You scrub your cheeks and the back of your neck with your wet palms, then take the rough linen cloth from its peg and pat your face dry. The cloth smells faintly of the rosemary sprig that was boiled with it when it was last washed. You fold it again and hang it back on the peg, smoothing the creases with one hand. Then you stand for a moment looking out of the small window, which is nothing more than a square opening set with thick greenish glass. Through it, you can see the upper branches of a plane tree in the courtyard below, its leaves stirring in a breeze that you cannot feel. They shift from silver green to dark green as they turn, and the motion is slow, like the breathing of a great calm animal. You dress without haste. From the wooden chest, you take a shirt of unbleached linen, soft from many washings, and pull it over your head. It falls loosely around your shoulders and you tuck it into the waist of your breeches, which are of plain brown wool and held up by a narrow leather belt. You sit on the stool to draw on your stockings, easing them up over your calves and tying the small cloth garters just below the knee. Your shoes are of sturdy leather, scuffed at the toes and polished only by the rubbing of your daily work. You lace them loosely, for you will not leave the building today. Over the shirt you put a sleeveless jerkin of dark grey wool, its front fastened with 4 horn buttons that you slit through their loops, one at a time, moving from the bottom to the top. You do not wear the blue coat now, the morning is already warm enough. On a shelf beside the chest there is a small wooden bowl holding a piece of bread, left over from yesterday's supper. You pick it up, break it in half, and pour a little olive oil from a small glazed jug onto a plate. You dip a corner of the bread into the oil and eat it slowly, standing by the window. The bread is chewy and slightly sour, the oil fruity and green gold, and together they fill your mouth with a clean, plain taste. You eat the entire piece, crumb by crumb, brushing the last loose flour from your fingers onto the plate. Then you lift the water jug that stands beside the bowl and drink directly from it. 2 slow swallows that wash away the dryness of sleep. Now you go to the door, which is low and made of heavy planks with a black iron latch. You lift the latch, feeling the cold metal under your thumb, and pull the door open. The corridor beyond is narrow and dim, lit by one small window at the far end that looks into the same courtyard. The walls here are also whitewashed, and the floor is laid with broad flagstones that have been worn to a dull sheen. You walk the short length of the corridor to the head of the stairs, your shoes making a soft scuff on the stone. At the top of the stairs you pause, as you always do, and look down into the shadow of the workshop below. You can smell the familiar mixture of old paper, sizing, gum arabic, and the faint dustiness of dry pigment. The air is still and cool. No one else is here yet. The other workrooms on this floor are silent, and their doors are closed. You descend the stairs slowly, one step at a time, letting your hand trail lightly along the plaster wall. The staircase is wooden, built against the inner wall of the house, and each tread gives a small wooden note under your weight, a series of soft notes that descend in pitch as you go lower. At the bottom you step into the long room where all the maps are made. It stretches away before you, a rectangle of dim space lit by 3 tall windows facing north. The windows are made of many small panes held together by lead lines, and through them the light falls in wide, steady sheets that do not shift with the hour. This north light is the reason the workshop was built here. It gives a clean illumination without the harsh shadows and changing angles of direct sun. You walk the length of the room to the back, where a smaller door leads to a tiny pantry. In that pantry there is a stone shelf holding a small jug of milk left by the dairyman's boy yesterday evening, a covered dish of soft cheese, and a round loaf of fresh bread wrapped in a cloth. You take the bread and the cheese back into the main room and set them on the end of a long table that is not used for drawing, but for sharing meals. You cut a slice of the new bread with the knife that lies on the board, and you spread a thick layer of the cheese onto it. The cheese is mild and creamy, slightly salty, and you eat it standing up, looking out of the nearest window into the courtyard. Down there, the baker's cat has appeared, a grey animal with a white chest, and she is washing her face with one paw, sitting exactly on the stone that marks the center of the yard. You watch her for a little while, chewing slowly. She finishes her washing, stands up, stretches, and then walks away out of sight around the corner of the well. Everything is very quiet. When you have finished eating, you brush the crumbs from the table into your palm and drop them into a small clay bowl that sits by the door for scraps. Then you walk to your own table, the one by the north window, the one that has been yours for the past 4 years. It is a great plank of oak, supported on trestles, its surface darkened by age and ink and the oils of countless hands. At the far side, near the window, there is a clear space where you do your actual drawing. Here the vellum from yesterday is still pinned down, the pin's bright brass heads set into the 4 corners. Beside it, your tools are laid out in a row, exactly as you left them. 2 brass dividers, a small pair of pointed legs and a larger pair with a curved arm, a boxwood ruler, its edge true and unworn, a steel straight edge for cutting, a small bone folder, 3 quills already cut and ready, their nibs resting on a scrap of silk so they will not blunt. A glass pot of iron gal ink, sealed with wax, a smaller pot of carbon ink for tying ying, sealed with wax, a small with a You look at this row of instruments the way a carpenter looks at his chisels before beginning a day's work, with a quiet recognition of each shape and weight and purpose. You lift the glass pot of iron gall ink and check the wax seal. It is whole and firm, so the ink will not have dried. You set it back. You pick up one of the quills and hold it to the light, looking through the slit to see that it is still clean and properly aligned. You run the tip over the ball of your thumb to feel the fine scratch of the nib. It is perfect. Then you pull the stool out from under the table, its legs making a small scraping sound on the flagstones, and you sit down. The rush seat accepts your weight with a slight crunch. You place both feet flat on the floor and let your hands rest, palms down, on the smooth oak in front of you. For a full minute you do nothing but sit there, feeling the coolness of the air on your face, the steady light from the window, the solidity of the table under your hands. The room breathes around you, and you breathe with it. A fly buzzes softly against the glass of the window, a low humming that rises and falls. You watch it crawl up the pane, then fly a short distance and land again, its tiny legs moving across the uneven surface. Beyond the glass, the leaves of the plane tree have stilled. The morning breeze has died away. A pigeon lands on the outer sill, coos once, and flies off. The shadow of the window frame lies sharp and unmoving on the tabletop. The workshop fills with the particular silence of a place where careful work is done, a silence that is made up of small, steady sounds, the subtle creak of old timbers adjusting to the warmth of the day, the soft rustle of a paper on a distant table as a current of air moves through the room, the occasional distant cry of a gull out over the harbour, muted by the thick walls. You pick up the lead point on a sheet of scrap paper that you keep for testing. You draw a simple line, a single curve that mimics the shape of a shallow bay. The lead leaves a faint silver-grey mark on the paper. Satisfied, you set the lead point aside and push the scrap paper to the corner of the table. Then you stand up again, not because you need to, but because your body is still waking and wants to move. You walk slowly around the table, touching the surfaces of things. The smooth round heads of the brass pins holding the vellum, the cool iron of the straight edge, the soft bristles of a dry brush. You stop at the window and press your forehead gently against the glass, the coolness spreading across your brow. Outside, the courtyard is now fully lit by the morning sun, which has climbed high enough to pour over the roof of the east wing. The flagstones of the yard show a pattern of light and shade, the shadow of the wellhead falling like a black teardrop on the grey stone. You can see the baker through his open doorway across the street, his bare arms dusted with flour as he kneads dough on a wooden table. He works with a slow, steady rhythm, folding and pressing, folding and pressing. You watch him without really thinking about him, the way you might watch a cloud move across a wide sky. After a short while you turn from the window and go to the large cabinet that stands against the wall near your table. It is a tall piece of furniture made of dark oak with iron strap hinges, and its doors are kept locked with a small brass key. You take the key from the ring at your belt, insert it, and turn it with a precise click. Inside, the cabinet is filled with sea journals, stacks of them, some bound in worn leather, some in limp vellum covers, their spines labelled with dates and the names of ships. You run your fingers along the row of volumes, feeling the different textures of the covers, the slight ridges of the binding cords, the smoothness of the vellum tags. You are looking for a particular journal, the one kept by a pilot named Santangle on a voyage to the western coast 6 years ago. You find it by touch before you find it by sight. The cover has a distinctive rough patch where seawater once dampened the leather and left a faint crystalline bloom. You pull it out, weigh it in your hand for a moment, and then carry it back to your table, where you lay it gently beside the pinned vellum. You do not open it yet. You close the cabinet, turn the key, and return to your stool. The journal waits. The vellum waits. The whole morning stretches ahead of you, long and quiet, and full of the time needed to draw one careful line after another. Outside the window, the day has fully arrived, and the first warmth begins to seep into the room, barely noticeable, as gentle as the touch of breath. The staircase is narrow and dark, its wooden treads worn into shallow hollows by the passage of many feet over many years. You place your left hand lightly on the plaster wall as you descend, feeling the cool graininess of the old lime under your palm, and you take each step with the slow care of a person who has long known these stairs but still respects their steepness. The treads give out small wooden notes under your weight, each one a little higher or lower than the one before, so that your descent produces a quiet, unplanned melody that fades into the air. The walls on either side are close, brushed smooth by the shoulders of generations of craftsmen, and the air grows cooler as you go down, carrying a faint smell of stone and earth from the foundations below. At the foot of the stairs, you step onto the flagstones of the long workshop, and a space opens around you like a held breath. The room runs the whole depth of the building, its far end softened by shadow, and 3 tall north-facing windows pour a steady grey light over everything. This light does not flicker or change with the angle of the sun. It lies across the tables and shelves with an even, almost liquid clarity, the kind of light that reveals every fibre in a sheet of paper and every pale scratch on a wooden surface. You stand for a moment just inside the doorway, letting your eyes adjust from the dimness of the stairwell. The everyday heroes, a colourful blend of sizing, old paper, gum arabic, and the faint sweetness of dust that has been disturbed by nothing more than the small currents of air that move whenever a door opens or a body passes. The workshop is empty at this hour. The other mapmakers will come later, perhaps at the 3rd bell, but now the room belongs entirely to the stillness and to you. You walk slowly forward, passing the first of the great oak tables. Its surface is a wide plain of dark wood, scarred here and there with old knife cuts and ink stains, and on it rests a half-finished chart of an inland sea, its coastlines drawn in a pale brown ink, the mountains behind them indicated by rows of tiny, inverted V's. You pause to look at it, not out of curiosity but from a habit of respectful observation, the way a weaver might glance at another's loom. The lines are clean and certain, the work of a steady hand, and you nod once to yourself before moving on. Beyond the table are the shelves, tall cases of dark oak that reach almost to the ceiling, their compartments filled with rolled charts. Each roll is tied with a linen tape and labelled with a small vellum tag that bears a date and a name written in a compact, slanting script: Costa de Azur, 1547, Islas de Poniente, 1550, Rias de Galicia, 1552. You let your gaze travel over the labels as you walk, recognizing some from your own hand and others from the hands of the men who worked here before you. The rolls sit quietly in their places, like sleeping creatures, each one holding a stretch of coast or a scatter of islands that someone once measured and drew with patient attention. Next, you pass the rack of bundled quills. It is a simple wooden frame with rows of pegs, and from each peg hangs a bundle of goose feathers tied with string, their shafts already stripped of the barbs except at the very tip. There are bundles of grey quills, bundles of white, and a few of the prized dark brown pinion feathers that hold an edge the longest. Below the rack, on a low shelf, sit the jars of ink, the iron gall that bites into the vellum and turns from pale grey to deep black as it dries, the carbon ink for fine permanent lines, and the small pots of coloured ink mixed from earth pigments, burnt sienna, green earth, lapis blue that will later tint the hills and shallows. You trail your fingers over the shelf as you pass, feeling the cool glass and the slight stickiness of old ink drops on the wood. At last you reach your own table, the one by the north window, the one that has been yours for the past 4 years. It is a fixed slab of oak supported on trestles, its front edge polished to a dark sheen by the constant rub of your forearms. The space nearest the window is kept clear for your current work, and there the sheet of vellum from yesterday lies pinned at its 4 corners, with brass pins that gleam dully in the grey light. Beside it, your tools are arranged in a row exactly as you left them. 2 brass dividers, one small with straight-pointed legs, one larger with a curved arm for describing circles. A ruler of polished boxwood, pale as wheat, its edge still true after years of use. A steel straight edge for cutting, a bone folder smooth as ivory, 3 quills resting on a scrap of scarlet silk, so their nibs will not blunt sealed pot a carboninken. A smallo pot, a dedepiakinkendinas. You stand looking at this arrangement, noting the exact positions of each item, and a feeling of quiet readiness settles over you. The north light falls across the tabletop in a broad rectangle, illuminating every grain of the oak and every faint scratch left by the dividers. You reach out and touch the vellum with the flat of your fingers. It is cool and smooth, stretched taut by the pins, and it gives off the faint animal scent of the calfskin it was made from. You press lightly at the center and find it perfectly flat, without any ripple or slackness. The moisture of the sizing has fully dried overnight, leaving the surface ready to receive ink. You lift your hand and look at the faint impression your fingers leave on the vellum before it fades, a ghost of warmth that disappears in a heartbeat. Now you turn your attention to the lamp. It stands at the back corner of the table, a simple brass vessel with a glass chimney that is slightly clouded from many hours of burning. You lift the chimney carefully, set it aside on a felt pad, and check the oil level by tilting the reservoir so that the pale liquid catches the light. It is nearly full, enough for the whole day. You trim the wick with a tiny pair of shears, snipping away the charred upper edge so that a fresh, even surface remains. Then you replace the chimney, take up the flint and steel from the little tray beside the lamp, and strike them once, twice, until a spark jumps into the wick and a small yellow flame appears. The flame wavers and smokes for a moment, but you turn the small brass key that raises and lowers the wick until it settles into a tall, steady teardrop of light, silent and almost still. The lamp throws a warm circle onto the tabletop that overlaps the cool north light and makes a gentle border of amber where the two illuminations meet. You draw the stool out from under the table, its legs giving a short, soft scuff against the flagstones, and you sit down. The rush seat accepts your weight with its familiar slight crunch, and you place both feet flat on the floor, letting your hands rest on your thighs. From this position, you can see through the window into the courtyard. The plane tree stands at the center, its broad leaves moving very gently in a breeze that must be stirring the upper air, though down here in the workshop you feel nothing. The leaves shimmer from dark green to silver and back again. A slow, hypnotic flicker that you watch without any thought of time. Below the tree, the flagstones show a pattern of light and shade, and the baker's cat has returned to sit on the central stone, a grey fur warm in the sun. You sit quietly for a little while, doing nothing but breathing. The lamp burns with a tiny hiss. The vellum waits. The tools gleam. The room holds its silence, and you feel yourself becoming part of that silence, your own heartbeat slowing to match the quiet rhythm of the morning. Then, with a slow, habitual movement, you reach out and take up the bone folder. You turn it over in your fingers, feeling its smoothness, and you run its rounded tip very lightly along the surface of the vellum, following the curve of an imaginary shoreline that you will soon draw. The bone leaves no mark, but you can feel the slight tooth of the skin through the tool, a fine resistance that tells you the surface is just rough enough to hold the ink without letting it spread. Satisfied, you set the folder down and pick up one of the quills, holding it to the lamp to check the slit. It is clean, the two tines perfectly aligned, the tip sharp and even. You wipe the nib on the scrap of silk and lay it back in its place. You adjust the position of the dividers so that they lie parallel to the ruler. You nudge the ink pot a little closer to the vellum. You unroll the soft rag and fold it into a neat square. These small adjustments are not necessary, but they are part of the ritual, the slow arranging of the body and the tools before the first mark is made. In the courtyard, the cat stands, stretches, and wanders away. The leaves of the plane tree continue their slow, silent dance. The light from the window stays exactly the same, and the lamp flame burns without a flicker. The workshop is so still that you can hear, very faintly, the tick of a beetle somewhere in the rafters, a tiny scratching sound that comes and goes. You turn on your stool and look back across the workshop. The long room stretches away in layers of shadow and light, the other tables standing empty, the shelves dark and orderly. A single mote of dust drifts through the shaft of light from the window, catching the sun and glowing for a moment like a tiny star before it passes into the shadow and disappears. You watch it go, and then you turn back to your table. The morning has fully settled in, and you are now entirely ready. The descent from your chamber, the walk through the quiet room, the lighting of the lamp, the checking of the vellum, all of these acts have woven themselves into a single state of calm readiness, a quiet alertness that asks nothing of you but patience and attention. The tools are arranged, the light is steady, and the invisible coast waits to be drawn. The cabinet stands against the wall to the left of your table, a tall piece of dark oak with iron strap hinges and a lock that catches with a precise click. You rise from your stool, step across the flagstones, and take the small brass key from the ring at your belt. The key is warm from lying against your hip, and it slides into the lock with the smoothness of long habit. You turn it, feeling the wards shift inside the metal, and the doors swing open with a low sound that is not quite a creak, but the soft sigh of old wood releasing its hold. Inside, the cabinet is deep and shadowed, its shelves filled with sea journals stacked flat or standing upright, their edges a patchwork of leather, vellum, and fraying tape. The scent that drifts out is dry and faintly salty, the smell of paper that has travelled through sea air and then rested for years in the dark. You stand before the open cabinet, letting your eyes move over the rows. Some journals are bound in dark calfskin, their covers worn pale around the edges where fingers held them. Others are wrapped in limp vellum covers that curl slightly at the corners. A few have no binding at all, but are simply gatherings of loose pages tied together with linen cord. On the spine or the foredge of each is a label written in fading ink, giving a name and a year: Costa de Algarve, 1538. Islas Afortunadas, 1538. Golfo de las Iguas, 1542. Golfo de las Iguas, 1549. Santangle, 1553. You reach for the last one, the journal kept by a pilot named Santangle on a voyage that mapped the western coast 6 years ago. You know it by its feel before your eyes confirm the label, because the leather has a rough patch on the lower cover where seawater once dampened it and left a faint crystalline bloom that has never softened. You pull the journal out, balancing its weight in your hand for a moment. It is a modest volume, about the length of your forearm, bound in plain brown leather with 3 raised bands on the spine. The edges of the pages are darkened by handling, and a small strip of linen tape marks a place about halfway through. You carry it back to your table, close the cabinet doors behind you, and turn the key with a soft click. Then you sit down, place the journal on the table beside the vellum, and let it rest there while you settle yourself. The lamp flame burns steadily, the north light falls across the oak, and the whole room is quiet. You open the journal carefully, lifting the upper cover and letting it lie flat. The first page is a title page, written in a formal hand that is not Santangle's own, but that of a scribe at the chart house. It reads, in dark brown ink, a relation of the coast west of the narrow sea, made by the pilot Pedro Santangle in the year 1553, being the 4th voyage of the caravel Santa Clara. Below this, in smaller script, is a note. This journal is the property of the Imperial Chart House and is not to be removed. You read these words slowly, though you have read them many times before. They are as familiar as a door you pass through every day. Then you turn the page, and the true journal begins. The handwriting of Santangle is small and slanting, full of abbreviations and personal marks that must be learned like a dialect. He writes in a dark brown ink that has faded to a soft sepia in places, and his letters are crowded together as if he were always conscious of the cost of paper. You bend closer to the page, resting your left forearm on the table and tilting your head slightly so that the lamplight falls directly on the lines. The first entry describes the departure from a port, noting the wind direction, the state of the tide, and the names of the headlands that fell away astern as the ship stood out to sea. You read this passage without hurry, tracing the words with the tip of your index finger as you go, feeling the slight indent where his quill pressed into the paper. You turn to the place marked by the linen strip, easing the page open and smoothing it flat with the heel of your hand. This entry describes a stretch of coast that the ship approached on a clear morning after 3 days of beating against a westerly wind. Santangle writes, "We made the land at first light, a low shore of dunes and marsh behind, with a tall headland bearing north-northwest, steep too on the western side, and a reef awash at half a league." You pause on the phrase steep too on the western side, and you try to see what he saw. You imagine a dark cliff rising straight from the water, the rock wet and shining where the waves break, and gulls wheeling white against the grey stone. You do not rush this imagining, you let it form slowly, piece by piece, like a picture emerging on a blank wall. The cliff becomes solid in your mind, and you hold it there for a moment before you return to the page. The next line describes soundings. Santangal records the depths in fathoms as the ship crept closer, 20 fathoms with sand and broken shell, then 15 with fine grey sand, then 12, then 10, and at 10 fathoms the bottom changed to mud with a scattering of small stones. He notes that the water turned to milky green where a river emptied into the sea from the marsh. He describes the smell of the land, a scent of damp earth and sweet grass that reached the ship even before the latesman called the first sounding. You read these details with a slow attention, letting each one settle. The numbers and words arrange themselves in your mind like the pieces of a puzzle that will, in time, become a coastline. You turn your head to look at the blank vellum pinned to your table. The empty space there is not yet a sea, but it will be. The sandings will go in first, placed at their proper distances, and then the line of the shore will curve to meet them. But before any mark can be made, you must understand exactly what Santangal saw. You turn back to the journal and read on. He writes of a low sandy point that stretched far out into the water, its tip marked by a solitary pine tree that leaned inland as if pushed by the constant wind. He writes of a bay behind the point, sheltered from the north and east, with good holding ground of blue clay. He notes the bearings of the headland and the pine tree. The headland bore south-southwest, the tree bore southwest by south, and the two in line gave a clear leading mark into the anchorage. You reach for a scrap of paper and the soft pencil that you keep in a groove of the ruler, and you write these bearings down in tiny numerals, your hand moving slowly and precisely. The pencil makes a soft, dragging sound on the paper, a whisper that is the only noise in the room. Now you turn back several pages to an earlier entry, one that describes the same stretch of coast but from a different approach. This is something you always do when you begin a new chart. You compare the entries, looking for the small agreements and discrepancies that reveal the true shape of the land. The earlier entry was made on the outward voyage, when the ship passed this coast in failing light and a rising swell. Santangal's handwriting is even more cramped there, and his notes are briefer. He gives the depth as 15 fathoms over coarse sand, not the fine grey sand he later recorded. He does not mention the pine tree at all, perhaps because the light was too poor to see it, or perhaps because the ship stood farther out to sea. But he does note the reef awash, and he places it at half a league from the headland, the same distance he gave on the later approach. The reef, then, is a solid fact, something that can be drawn with confidence. You take up the scrap of paper and make another tiny note. Reef, half league west of headland, awash at low water. Then you set the pencil down and let your hands rest flat on the table. The lamp flame gives a small sputter, and you reach over to adjust the wick very slightly, bringing it back to an even, steady tongue of light. The walls of the workshop seem to have drawn closer around you, holding the quiet close. Outside, the courtyard is still empty, and the sun has climbed just high enough to touch the upper panes of the window, though the north light remains as grey and even as ever. You return to the journal and read through the next several entries, which follow the coast as it trends eastward and then south into a wide estuary. Santangal writes of sandbars that shift with the seasons, of channels that deepen and shoal, of a village on a low hill where small fishing boats were drawn up on the beach. He notes the colour of the water, the smell of wood smoke from the village, the call of unfamiliar birds. You read each sentence slowly, sometimes repeating a phrase to yourself under your breath, your lips moving silently. When you come to a passage that describes the shape of the estuary mouth, with its two long spits of sand curving toward each other like the tips of a closing hand, you pause and look again at the blank vellum. You can almost see the spits there, pale golden shapes against the cream skin, and you know that when you draw them you will use tiny dots of ink to show the sand, a technique you learned from the old master whose stool you now sit on. You spend a long time with the journal, turning the pages one by one, tracing the coast southward through inlets and bays, past rocky points and long beaches, until Santangal's voyage carries him out of the region that concerns your current chart. At that point you close the journal, lay the strip of linen back in its place to mark your progress, and sit back on your stool. Your eyes feel the pleasant tiredness that comes from close reading, a slight warmth behind the lids. You close your eyes for a moment, and in the darkness you can still see the slanting lines of Sant'Angel's handwriting, the numbers of the soundings, the shape of that steep to headland on the western side. When you open your eyes again, you reach for the journal once more, but not to read further. You lift it and hold it in both hands, feeling the weight of it and the roughness of that salt-damaged leather. Then you stand, walk to the cabinet, and return it gently to its place on the shelf. You do not lock the cabinet yet. You will need it again later. Instead, you leave the key in the lock and go back to your table, where the scrap of paper lies, covered in your tiny pencil marks. You pick it up and read through the notes you have made, depths, bearings, descriptions of landmarks, the shape of the estuary mouth, the reef, the pine tree. All of it is now held in your mind as well as on the scrap, a gathered collection of facts and images that will guide your hand when the time comes to draw. You sit down once more, push the scrap paper to the corner of the table, and let your gaze rest on the vellum. The empty space there no longer looks entirely empty. It is full of the invisible coast that Sant'Angelo saw, the coast that you have walked in your imagination, step by step, mile by mile, through his words. You know its shape now, its character, its dangers and its shelters. You know where the water deepens and where the sandbars lie. You know the smell of the marsh and the look of the cliff. All that remains is to translate this knowledge into ink. But that translation will come later. For now, it is enough to have read, to have listened to the voice of a man who sailed those waters, and to have let his remembered sight become the beginnings of a line. You fold your hands on the table, and the quiet of the workshop settles around you like a blanket. The vellum lies pinned and empty, its pale surface holding nothing but the faint animal grain and the memory of the sizing brush. You sit before it with the lamp burning at your left hand and the north light falling steady across the table, and you know that before the first line of the coast can be drawn, the sheet must be given a hidden structure, a web of guidance that will keep every cape and inlet in its true proportion. This is the invisible grid, the ghost of geometry that lies beneath all maps, and you are about to lay it down with a silver stylus and a ruler of boxwood, using no ink at all. You begin by taking up the boxwood ruler, a strip of pale honey-colored wood that is exactly 1 cubit long and 2 fingers wide. Its edges are straight and true, and along its length someone long ago incised a fine line at every thumb width, each one marked with a tiny numeral that you can read by touch as much as by sight. You run your thumb along these marks now, counting them softly, a habit that settles your mind into the rhythm of measurement. The wood is cool and smooth, polished by the oils of countless hands, and it rests in your grip with the comfortable weight of a tool that has shaped many maps before this one. You set the ruler down along the left margin of the vellum, aligning its outer edge with the very border of the sheet. Then you take up the silver stylus. It is a slim rod, no thicker than a goose quill, its tip a fine point of polished silver that will leave a faint grey groove in the vellum without cutting or tearing the skin. You hold it as you would a pen, but with a lighter touch, letting the point rest against the ruler's edge. Taking a slow breath, you press just enough to indent the surface and draw the stylus downward in a single steady stroke from the top of the sheet to the bottom. The sound it makes is a soft whisper, like a dry leaf dragged across stone, and it stops the moment you lift your hand. The line that remains is so pale that it is barely visible. You have to tilt your head and let the lamplight rake across the surface to see it, a hair-fine groove that catches the glow and turns it into a thread of silver. That first line is your anchor. From it all other lines will be measured, and so you take a moment to be certain it is true. You place the ruler against it once more and squint along the edge, checking that no waver or curve has crept in. It is perfect. You set the ruler aside and pick up the larger pair of brass dividers, the ones with the curved arm and the fine steel points. You open them by pressing the legs gently apart, the hinge moving with the smooth, oiled resistance, until the distance between the points matches the width of 2 thumb marks on the ruler. You test the measurement by touching the points to the ruler's incised lines, closing one eye to be sure they align exactly. A tiny adjustment, a fraction of a hair, and then you lock the hinge with the brass screw so that the setting will not slip. Now you return to the vellum and place one point of the dividers precisely at the top end of that first silver line. The point leaves a microscopic prick in the skin, a mark that will be covered later by the border, but that now serves as a reference. You swing the dividers gently outward and let the other point descend to touch the vellum, where it makes a second tiny prick exactly 2 thumb widths lower. You lift the dividers, move the lower point to the new prick, and step downward again, marking a third point. In this way, with slow and patient repetition, you march down the entire length of the left margin, leaving a column of faint prick marks that divide the edge of the sheet into equal parts. Each step with the dividers is the same. The hinge does not shift, the points are sharp, and the vellum accepts the marks without complaint. When you reach the bottom, you count the intervals in a low murmur, touching each prick with the tip of the stylus to be certain none have been missed. The number matches the latitude range of the coast you will draw, each interval standing for 1 league of distance, and this correspondence pleases you in a quiet, mathematical way. You now have a measured scale along the left edge. You repeat the entire process along the right edge, carrying the same divider setting across the sheet so that the marks on both sides align exactly. To do this, you lay the ruler across the vellum from left to right, checking that its edge passes through the first left-hand prick and meets the right margin at a perfect right angle, which you verify with a small wooden square that has been in the workshop longer than anyone can remember. The square is a simple triangle of pear wood with 1 right angle and 2 sharp corners, and you press it against the ruler's edge and the margin, adjusting the ruler until the fit is snug and true. Then you mark the right-hand point with the dividers and step downward again as before. The work is repetitive and without urgency. Your hand moves in a quiet cycle of measure, prick, lift and measure again, while the morning light holds steady and the lamp burns on. With both margins marked, you turn the sheet carefully on the table, lifting 1 pin at a time and rotating the vellum so that what was the top edge now lies along the left. You pin the corners down again, smoothing the surface with your palm to remove any disturbance, and then you repeat the entire measuring process to create the horizontal divisions. The ruler goes along the new left margin, the stylus draws its whisper-fine line, and the dividers step downward once more, leaving a column of prick marks that will become the lines of longitude. You work with the same unhurried pace, the same small adjustments of the divider points, the same quiet counting. The room is so still that you can hear the tiny crunch of the silver point entering the vellum, a sound no louder than a pin dropping onto felt. Now the vellum is surrounded by a border of tiny prick marks, an invisible fence of measured points that wait to be connected. You take up the boxwood ruler and the silver stylus again and begin the long process of joining them. You align the ruler's edge so that it passes exactly through the first left-hand prick and the first right-hand prick, and then you draw the stylus steadily from one side to the other, pressing just hard enough to leave a continuous groove. The line appears as a pale scratch across the cream surface, so faint that it vanishes if you look at it directly, and only reappears when you catch the light from the side. You move down the sheet, aligning the ruler with the next pair of marks and drawing the next line, and then the next, a slow progression from top to bottom. Each line is parallel to the one above it, because the ruler never changes and the marks were made with a fixed divider setting, and the whole effect is of a delicate ghostly ladder lying flat across the skin. When all the horizontal lines are drawn, you rotate the sheet back to its original orientation and draw the vertical lines in the same way, connecting the top and bottom margin marks. Now the vellum carries a net of faint lines, a grid of pale silver-grey grooves that cross at precise right angles. The intersections are tiny points where the stylus has passed twice, and they catch the light like the smallest possible stars. You sit back on your stool and look at the sheet, letting your eyes travel across the network. The lines are so subtle that they seem to disappear when you blink, but they are there, a hidden scaffold that will guide every subsequent mark. The grid is a thing of quiet beauty, a piece of pure geometry laid down by hand and eye, and you allow yourself a moment of simple satisfaction before you move on. But the grid is not yet complete. It lacks numbers, and a map without numbers is a mute thing. You reach for the soft pencil and the scrap paper where you noted Santangle's latitudes, and you begin to number the lines at the left margin. You write each figure with a small, rounded hand, using the pencil because these numbers are for the engraver's reference and will not appear on the final inked chart. The latitude increases from north to south, 41 degrees, 41.5, 42, 42.5, and so on, each number placed beside its corresponding horizontal line. You check each figure against Santangle's notes, comparing the degrees he recorded at various headlands and river mouths with the positions they will occupy on this grid. The numbers go in slowly, one after another, and the pencil makes a soft, dusty sound on the vellum that mingles with the lamp's tiny hiss. Next you turn to the right margin and write the same numbers again, so that a navigator can read the latitude from either side. Then you rotate the sheet and number the vertical lines with the longitudes, working from Santangle's estimated distances and from the standard meridian that the chart house uses for all its western charts. The longitude numbers are more tentative because longitude at sea is a matter of dead reckoning and careful guesswork, but you write them down nonetheless, using the pencil so that they can be adjusted later if a better estimation comes. Each figure is a small, neat shape, and you take care that every digit is clear and level. When the numbering is done, you set the pencil aside and rest your hands flat on the table. The grid lies before you, a complete skeleton of lines and numbers, ready to receive the flesh of the coast. You lean forward and blow very gently across the surface, a soft breath that removes any stray particles of dust or a razor crumb, and the lines seem to brighten for a moment as the moisture of your breath catches the grooves. Then they settle back into near invisibility, waiting. The lamp flame bends slightly in a current of air that moves through the room, and you reach to adjust the wick again, turning the tiny brass key until the flame stands tall and still. The north light has not changed, for it never changes, but the shadows in the corners of the workshop have deepened by a fraction, a sign that the sun outside has moved a little higher. You become aware of a faint sound from the courtyard. The baker's wife is calling to someone in a voice that carries but does not disturb, a sound as soft as the cooing of a pigeon. You listen without attending, letting the sound pass over you, and then you return your attention to the vellum. There is one more step before the grid can be considered finished. You take up the brass dividers again, the smaller pair this time, and you check the distances between several of the horizontal lines at different points along the sheet. You measure from the first line to the 5th, then from the 10th to the 15th, then from the 20th to the 25th, comparing the spans to the ruler to be certain that no cumulative error has crept in. The measurements agree at every point. The grid is true. You close the dividers and set them back in their place, the points clicking softly together. Now you look at the sheet one more time, and you see not a grid, but the ghost of a map. The lines seem to suggest the coast even before you have drawn it. The curve of the shore will follow the gentle slope of the latitude, and the river mouths will align with certain intersections, and the soundings will fall into the squares like stones dropped into a measured pond. You can almost trace the coast in your mind, running your inner eye along the imaginary track from north to south, following the headlands and bays that Santangel described. The invisible grid has done its work, and the vellum is no longer empty, but pregnant with the shape of the land. You stand up slowly, pushing the stool back, and stretch your arms above your head, feeling the pleasant pull in your shoulders from the long period of leaning forward. You walk to the window and look out at the courtyard, where the cat has returned and is now curled on the warm stone, her tail wrapped around her body. The plane tree is still, and the baker's doorway is empty. You stand there for a little while, letting your eyes rest on the simple shapes of the yard, and then you return to your table, ready at last to draw the first inked line of the coast. But that will be a new chapter, and for now the grid is complete, the silent architecture waiting in the vellum like a memory of light. The grid lies on the vellum, like a memory of light, faint silver grooves that vanish when you look at them directly, and reappear only when the lamp catches them from the side. You sit before the sheet with your hands resting on the table, feeling the quiet readiness that has been building since you first ascended the stairs this morning. The time has come to draw the first ink line, the line that will become the coast, and you reach for the small, wax-sealed pot of iron gall ink, with a movement that is both deliberate and calm. You take the pot in your left hand and hold it up to the lamp, checking the surface of the wax that seals the cork stopper. The wax is dark brown and bears the imprint of the chart house seal. A small compass rose pressed into it while it was still warm, and it is whole and uncracked. You set the pot down, pick up the small knife that lies among your tools, and slip the point under the edge of the wax. A gentle twist of the blade, and the seal lifts away in 2 clean halves that you place on the felt pad beside the lamp. Then you work the cork free with a soft, repeated pressure of your thumb, rocking it back and forth until it loosens and pulls out with a small dry sound. The smell of the ink rises to meet you, a sharp, dark smell of oak gall and iron salts, with a faint undernote of vinegar from the gum arabic that thickens it. You take the glass stirring rod from the tray beside the lamp and lower it into the pot, stirring the ink in slow circles. The liquid moves heavily, a deep grey that looks almost black in the dim light, and as you stir, a thin spiral of lighter colour forms at the centre of the vortex and then disappears. You stir for a full minute, watching the ink smooth out and become uniform, and then you withdraw the rod and wipe it clean on the soft rag. A dark smear stains the cloth, and you fold it over so that a clean surface spaces up. Now you take up the small oyster shell that serves as your dipping well. It is a plain shell, about the width of your palm. Its inner surface smooth and slightly iridescent, and it has been used for this purpose for so long that a permanent grey stain clouds the deepest part of the bowl. You pour a shallow pool of ink from the pot into the shell, tilting the pot slowly so that the liquid runs in a thin, controlled stream. The ink settles in the shell with a surface that reflects the lamp flame as a tiny yellow point, and you set the pot aside and close it loosely with the cork so that the ink will not evaporate. The quill you choose is one you cut yourself 2 days ago, a grey goose feather with the barb stripped away except for a small tuft at the top that helps with balance. You pick it up from its resting place on the scrap of scarlet silk and hold it to the light, checking the nib one more time. The slit is clean and central, the 2 tines perfectly even, and the tip has been shaped to a fine, slightly flexible point that will produce a line of variable width depending on the pressure you apply. You dip the nib into the pool of ink, letting it draw up just enough liquid to fill the slit, and then you tap it gently against the rim of the shell to remove any excess. A tiny dark drop falls back into the pool and vanishes. Now you turn to the vellum. The grid is there, faint and waiting, and you have already decided where the coast will begin. It will start at the upper left corner of the sheet, where the latitude line of 42 degrees meets the left margin, and it will descend in a gradual curve toward the south and east. You place your left hand on the table to steady yourself, keeping the heel of your palm on the clean oak and your fingers hovering just above the vellum, so that they do not touch the sized surface. Then you lower the quill until the nib makes contact with the skin, exactly at the intersection of the margin and the first horizontal line, and you begin to draw. The first stroke is a gentle downward curve, a smooth arc that moves from left to right and slightly downward, following the contour of a shallow bay that Santangle described as having a sandy bottom and good shelter from the northerly wind. The ink flows from the quill in a thin, even line, a pale grey at first that will darken to a deep black as it dries, and the iron reacts with the air. You move your hand slowly, letting the curve develop at its own pace, and you watch the line as it appears on the vellum with a feeling of quiet satisfaction. The quill makes a soft, scratching sound, a sound that is as familiar to you as your own breathing, and the line follows the exact path you intended, neither wavering nor hesitating. At the end of the bay, the coast turns sharply northward to form a small cape. You lift the quill, touch it to the rim of the shell to refresh the ink, and then begin a new stroke that pushes upward and outward in a blunt projection. The cape is steep too on its western side, just as Santangle noted, and you indicate this by drawing the line with a slightly heavier pressure so that the ink spreads a fraction wider, suggesting a bold headland that rises straight from the sea. You pause at the tip of the cape, lift the quill, and look at what you have drawn. The bay and the cape lie on the vellum like the first two notes of a melody, and the rest of the coast stretches before you in your imagination, waiting to be brought down in ink. Beyond the cape, the shore trends eastward in a long, gentle curve that will become a series of small inlets. You dip the quill again and begin to draw them, one after another, moving your hand in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Each inlet is a small indentation in the coastline, a concave curve that pushes briefly inland and then returns to the general line of the shore. You make them slightly irregular, varying their depth and width so that they look natural rather than mechanical. And as you work, you glance occasionally at the notes you took from Santangle's journal to check the shape and spacing. "The inlets are shallow," he wrote, "with marshy ground behind, and you imagine the cordgrass and the salt pools that lie just beyond the line you were drawing. The quill needs fresh ink after every few inlets, and each time you dip it, you tap the nib against the shell and wait a moment for the excess to fall away. This rhythm dip, tap, draw, lift, dip again becomes a kind of meditation, a cycle that carries you along the coast without any sense of hurry." The lamp burns on, and the north light continues to fall through the window, and the only change in the room is the slow growth of the incline across the vellum. After the inlets, the coast straightens into a long, sandy reach that runs almost due south. Here you change your technique slightly, using the very tip of the nib to draw a thin, even line that barely varies in width. This is the stretch of shore that Santangle described as low dunes behind the beach, with the solitary pine tree leaning inland at the southern end, and you mark the spot where the tree stands by drawing a tiny symbol, a small circle with a dot at its center, just inland of the shoreline. The symbol is no larger than a grain of wheat, but it will tell a navigator everything he needs to know. Here is the landmark, here is the point where the coast turns. Now the coast turns again, swinging westward, to form the long sandy spit that curls like a closing hand toward the opposite shore. You draw this spit with tiny dots of ink instead of a continuous line, using just the very point of the quill to make a stippled track across the vellum. Each dot is placed with care, close to its neighbor but not touching, so that the overall effect is of a granular, shifting edge, a place where the sand and the sea are always in motion. This is a technique that took you many months to learn, and even now it requires a particular steadiness of hand and a patience that you have cultivated over years. You place the dots one by one, moving the quill in small, precise movements, and the spit grows slowly, grain by grain, across the empty sea space. At the tip of the spit, the channel narrows to a gap that Santangle measured as one cable's length across. You leave a small break in the dotted line to indicate the entrance, and on either side you draw the tiny anchor symbols that mark the recommended anchorage. The anchors are simple shapes, a vertical line crossed by a curved horizontal, and you draw them with 2 quick strokes of the quill. Then you sit back and look at the spit as a whole, comparing its shape to the description in your notes. The curve is right, the gap is placed correctly, and the dots give exactly the impression of a low, sandy tongue of land that a ship would need to approach with caution. Beyond the spit, the coast resumes its solid line and begins to trend southward again, past a small rocky island that you draw as a rough oval just offshore. Santangle noted that this island was barren, with a white stain of guano on its summit and a small colony of seals on its northern beach, and you add a few tiny dots to the oval to suggest the rocks at its base. The coastline itself becomes more irregular here, with small rocky headlands alternating with crescent beaches, and you vary the pressure of the quill to show the difference. Heavier lines for the hard rock of the headlands, lighter strokes for the soft curves of the beaches. The morning wears on, and the coastline continues to grow. You draw the mouth of a small river as a neat V that cuts inland through the shore, its sides tapering as they go. You draw a marshy lagoon shown as a cluster of tiny horizontal dashes that suggest reed beds. You draw a long, straight cliff line where the land rises abruptly from the sea, and you emphasize it with a double line, a second stroke running parallel to the first, at a distance of half a thumb width. This double line will later be filled with a pale wash of burnt sienna to indicate the height of the cliff. But for now, it stands as a simple ink boundary, clean and certain. Every so often, you pause and rest your hand. You set the quill down on its silk pad, flex your fingers several times, and look away from the vellum to give your eyes a rest. You might turn to the window and watch the plane tree for a moment, its leaves now almost still in the midday calm. Or you might look across the workshop at the shelves of rolled charts, letting your gaze travel over the labels without reading them. These pauses are not interruptions, they are part of the rhythm of the work, the small rests that keep the hand steady and the mind clear. When you return to the quill, your fingers feel fresh and the ink flows as smoothly as before. By the time the coast reaches the lower third of the sheet, the light through the window has begun to shift, not in quality, but in angle, and the shadow of the lamp has crept a little farther across the tabletop. You have drawn nearly half the coastline now, from the northern bay all the way down past the spit and the island and the cliff, to the broad estuary that Sant'Agnolo described as the best natural harbour on this entire shore. The estuary mouth is wide and deep, and you draw its two enclosing arms with long, sweeping curves that reach out toward the sea like a pair of open gates. Inside the estuary, you leave the space blank for now. The soundings and the shoals will come later, in their own time. For now, the ink line is enough, a continuous ribbon of dark grey that snakes across the vellum from north to south, carrying the shape of the land from your mind into the visible world. You dip the quill one more time, tap it against the rim of the shell, and continue drawing, following the coast as it turns gently toward the bottom margin, mile after quiet mile. The coastline lies on the vellum now, a continuous ribbon of dark ink that snakes from the upper left corner down to the broad estuary mouth near the bottom margin. You have drawn the capes and inlets, the sandy spit and the rocky island, the river mouth and the long cliff, and the shore as a whole has taken on the shape that Sant'Agnolo described in his journal. But a coastline alone is only half a chart. The sea that washes against it must also be described, and the description takes the form of numbers, the soundings that tell a pilot how deep the water is, how close he can stand to the land, and where the hidden dangers lie beneath the surface. This chapter of the work is a patient, meticulous task, and you turn to it now with the same quiet readiness that has guided your hand all morning. You set aside the quill you used for the coastline and choose a finer pen, a crow quill with a sharper point and a narrower slit. This pen will produce the very thin, precise lines and numerals that the soundings require, and you test it on the scrap of paper that lies at the corner of your table. The line it draws is hairfine, a dark grey thread that looks almost like a pencil mark, and you nod once before laying the pen on the silk pad. Next you take up the table of figures that you copied from the lead-line log in Sant'Agnolo's journal, a small sheet of paper covered with your own tiny pencil numerals arranged in columns. The columns show the latitude and longitude of each sounding, the depth in fathoms, and a brief note on the character of the bottom: sand, mud, shell, rock. You read through the list slowly, tracing the figures with your finger, and you begin to plan the placement of each number on the chart. The vellum carries its silver grid beneath the coastline, and the grid will guide you in placing the soundings at their correct positions. You orient yourself by finding the latitude line that passes through the mouth of the estuary, then counting the horizontal lines northward to the first sounding that Sant'Agnolo recorded. It lies at 41 degrees and a half, a little to seaward of the rocky island, and the depth there was 23 fathoms over coarse sand, mixed with broken shell. You locate the approximate spot on the vellum, a point in the blank sea space to the left of the island, and you lower the crow quill until its tip touches the skin. The first number you write is a small, neat 23, and you draw a tiny circle around it with a single smooth rotation of your hand. The circle is no larger than a lentil, and it encloses the number like a ring enclosing a gem. You press just hard enough to make the ink flow evenly, and when you lift the pen, the sounding sits on the vellum as a complete little unit, a self-contained packet of information. A pilot reading this chart will see the 23 and know that here, at this exact spot, the lead line found merely 1/4 fathoms, deep enough for any ship to pass safely. You move southward to the next sounding, which Sant'Agnolo recorded at 1/2 league from the previous one. You measure the half-league distance on the boxwood ruler, converting the real-world span to the scale of the chart, and you prick the spot very lightly with the point of the dividers to guide your pen. The depth here was 19 fathoms, and the bottom was fine grey sand. You write a small 19 and draw its circle, and then you sit back to compare the two soundings on the vellum. The space between them is proportionally correct, and the numbers march outward from the shore in a line that will help a navigator understand the slope of the seabed. The work proceeds in this manner for a long, quiet stretch of time. You read a figure from the table, locate its position on the grid, measure the distance from the previous sounding, mark the spot with a tiny divider prick, and then write the number with its enclosing circle. The numerals are small and compact, written in a hand that is even smaller than the one you use for labels, and you take care that every digit is clear and distinct. A 3 must not be mistaken for an 8, a 7 must not look like a 1, and so you form each number with deliberate strokes, paying attention to the curves and angles that give the digits their identity. As you work southward along the coast, the soundings change in depth, and the pattern they make on the vellum begins to reveal the underwater topography. Close to the shore, the numbers are smaller, 8 fathoms, 6 fathoms, 4 fathoms, and then a single 2 near a rocky point where Santangelo noted that the bottom came up sharply. Further out, the numbers increase again, deepening to 10, 15, 20 fathoms, and the circles spread apart as the seabed drops away into the open sea. You can see the shape of the bottom emerging on the vellum, like a landscape beneath the waves. A landscape of valleys and ridges that no eye will ever see directly, but that every mariner must know. You pause to rest your hand and to wipe the crow quill clean with the rag. The nib has picked up a tiny fragment of vellum fiber, and you remove it carefully with the edge of your thumbnail, taking care not to distort the slit. Then you dip the pen in the ink shell, tap away the excess, and return to the table of figures. The next stretch of coast is the broad estuary, and here the soundings multiply. Santangelo made a careful survey of the approaches, taking many more lead line casts than he did along the open shore, and his table shows a dense cluster of depths that must be transferred to the chart with special precision. You begin at the outer edge of the estuary, where the sea is still open, and you place the first sounding at 22 fathoms over blue clay. Then you move inward, following the channel as it winds between the two sandy arms of the estuary mouth, and you write the numbers one after another: 18, 15, 12, 10, and then a sharp decrease to 5 fathoms, where a submerged bar lies across the entrance. The bar is a critical feature, and you mark it not only with soundings, but with a broken line that runs in a shallow arc from one arm of the estuary to the other. You draw the line with a series of short dashes, each dash separated from the next by a gap the width of a needle. The dashes are made with the same fine crow quill, and you move the pen in tiny, precise strokes, keeping the line smooth and continuous in its overall curve, even as the individual dashes break it into segments. The broken line tells a navigator that here the water shoals suddenly, that at low tide the bar may be almost dry, and that entrance to the estuary requires careful timing and a rising tide. Inside the bar, the water deepens again, and you place soundings of 7, 9, and 11 fathoms in a curving channel that leads toward the river mouth at the head of the estuary. The channel is flanked by shallows, and you indicate these with patches of fine stippling, using just the very tip of the crow quill to make hundreds of tiny dots that cluster together in irregular shapes. The stippling is a slow process. You must place each dot individually, tapping the pen against the vellum with a light, controlled motion, and the dots must be close enough together to read as a shaded area, but not so close that they merge into a solid blob. You work outward from the channel, building the stippled areas gradually, and as you go, you check the table of figures to ensure that the boundaries of the shallows match the depths that Santangelo recorded. Now you turn your attention to the shoals that lie scattered along the open coast beyond the estuary. Santangelo noted several of these, and he gave their positions in relation to prominent headlands. 3 leagues south of the Great Cliff, he wrote, there is a shoal of rock and gravel that dries at low water and is marked by a permanent rip. You locate the spot on the grid, measuring 3 leagues southward from the double line of the cliff, and you mark the position with a tiny cross. Then you draw the outline of the shoal with a dotted line, a rough oval that sits to seaward of the coast. Inside the oval you write the words Roca y Cascajo in a small italic script, and you add a single sounding of 1 fathom to indicate the depth at high water. The shoal is a hazard, but on the chart it is a clear, quiet warning, and any pilot who reads this coast will know to give it a wide berth. There is another shoal further south, a bank of sand that shifts with the seasons, and you handle this one differently. Santungal noted that the bank was charted at 3 fathoms on one voyage, but had shallowed to 2 fathoms on the next, and he recommended that mariners treat it as an area of uncertain depth. You draw this bank with a series of very faint, widely spaced dots, creating a shape that is deliberately vague, its boundaries suggested rather than defined. Within the bank you write a single word, mutable, changeable, and you add no soundings at all, leaving the space blank to indicate that the depth is unknown and should be approached with caution. This is an act of cartographic honesty, a quiet admission that the sea is not always knowable, and it pleases you to make it. The hours pass, and the sea around the coastline fills slowly with numbers and symbols. You add the small anchor signs for the recommended anchorages, placing them in the shelter of the capes and inside the estuary mouth where the holding ground of blue clay was noted by Santungal. You add the broken lines that mark the reefs, drawing them with careful reference to the journal, which described each reef by its bearing and distance from the nearest land. You add the symbols for rocks that are always submerged, shown as tiny crosses, and the symbols for rocks that are awash at low water, shown as small asterisks with a dot at the center. Each symbol is drawn with the same fine crow quill, and each one requires a small adjustment of the hand, a tiny pause before the pen touches the vellum. Your back has grown slightly stiff from leaning over the table, and you stand up once to stretch, placing your hands on your lower spine and arching gently backward. You walk to the window and look out at the courtyard, where the sun has moved far enough that the shadow of the plane tree now falls across the wellhead. The cat is gone, and the baker's doorway is quiet. You stand there for a minute or two, letting your eyes rest on the simple geometry of the yard, and then you return to the stool, settle yourself, and pick up the quill again. The last soundings you place are those at the southern edge of the chart, where the coast runs out of the vellum and the sea takes over entirely. Here the depths are greater and the numbers are higher, 30 fathoms, 35, 40, the figures growing larger as the bottom drops away into the deep ocean. You write these final soundings with a sense of quiet completion, and you draw their enclosing circles with a steady hand. Then you set down the crow quill, wipe the nib clean on the rag, and place it on its silk pad beside the other pens. The chart now carries not only the shape of the land, but also the shape of the sea floor beneath it. The soundings and shoals, the bars and reefs, the anchorages and the changeable banks, all are present. All are placed in their correct positions according to the grid and the journal. The vellum is no longer a blank sheet, but a living document, a thing that speaks in numbers and symbols to anyone who knows the language. You sit back on your stool and look at the whole composition, your eyes travelling slowly over the coastline, the numbers, the dotted lines, the tiny stippled shallows. There is more work to do, the washes of colour and the rum lines and the compass rose, but for now the sea has been sounded and its dangers marked, and that is enough. The coastline and its soundings lie dark and complete upon the vellum, a web of ink that has transformed the empty sheet into a speaking chart. But the map is still a thing of line alone, a skeleton without flesh, and it is colour that will give it depth and meaning. You rise from your stool and walk to the small cabinet that stands against the wall beside the window, a low piece of furniture with 2 doors and a single shelf inside. On that shelf sit the pigments in their various containers, small glazed pots, folded paper packets, a few stoppered glass vials, and one larger earthenware jar of powdered chalk. You kneel down, open the doors, and begin to bring the materials out one by one, setting them on the end of your table in a neat row. The pigments have names that sound like the places they come from. Burnt sienna, a warm reddish-brown earth from the hills near the city of Siena, sits in a small pot with a cork stopper. Green earth, a soft grey-green powder from the quarries of Verona, is wrapped in a square of coarse paper tied with string. Indigo, a deep blue that comes from far-off eastern lands in hard, dark cakes, rests in its own wooden box lined with raw cotton. A small glass vial holds a fine black carbon powder made from burnt vine twigs, and the earthenware jar contains a quantity of ground chalk, white and soft as flour. You arrange these vessels in the order you will use them, and then you go to the pantry to fetch a jug of clean water and a small bowl. Back at the table, you pour water into the bowl and set it beside the pigments. You also bring out a flat stone slab, a piece of smooth grey slate that serves as your grinding surface, and a glass muller with a broad, flat base that fits neatly in your palm. The muller is heavy and cool, and you wipe it clean with a damp cloth before you begin. Then you take a small portion of the burnt sienna from its pot, a spoonful of the fine rust-coloured powder, and place it in a mound on the centre of the slate. You add a few drops of water from the bowl, just enough to wet the powder, and you begin to grind the mixture with the muller, moving the glass disc in slow, steady circles. The grinding makes a soft, gritty sound, a low susurrus that fills the quiet at the workshop. As you work the muller, the pigment breaks down into finer and finer particles, and the water turns from clear to a muddy orange-brown. You grind for a long time, adding a few more drops of water when the paste grows too thick, and you watch the colour deepen as the particles release their full intensity. When the paste is perfectly smooth and no grittiness remains between the muller and the stone, you stop and scrape the mixture into a small glazed dish using a thin bone spatula. Then you add more water, a larger quantity this time, and stir the mixture with a glass rod until it becomes a thin, translucent wash, the colour of weak tea. You test the wash on a scrap of the same vellum that the chart is made from. You dip a fine brush into the liquid and paint a small swatch on the scrap, letting it dry for a moment in the air. The colour that remains is a pale, warm brown, exactly the shade of distant hills under a summer sky, and it is transparent enough that the ink lines beneath it show clearly through. Satisfied, you set the dish of burnt sienna wash aside and turn your attention to the chart. The hills behind the coast are the first areas to receive colour. You take up a broad squirrel brush, its bristles soft and full, and you dip it into the wash, pressing the excess liquid out against the rim of the dish. The brush holds a good quantity of fluid, and you apply it to the vellum in long, smooth strokes that follow the contours of the land behind the shoreline. The wash goes on pale and even, a faint veil of colour that darkens slightly as it dries. You work from the north end of the chart downward, covering the inland areas with the same thin wash, and you take care to keep the colour within the boundaries indicated by the inked coastline and the faint pencil notations you made earlier. Where the hills rise higher, you add a second layer of wash, waiting for the first to dry completely before applying the next. The drying time is a pause in the work, a short interval during which you sit back and let the air do its task. The vellum absorbs the moisture slowly, and the colour changes from a wet gleam to a soft matte finish, the pigment settling into the very surface of the skin. You watch this process without impatience, your hands resting in your lap. When the first layer is dry, you dip the brush again and paint the second layer over the higher ground, building up a slightly darker tone that suggests altitude and shadow. The hills begin to emerge from the flat surface like shapes appearing through a thinning mist. Next, you prepare the blue-grey wash for the shallows. You take a small amount of indigo from its wooden box, a chip no larger than your thumbnail, and you place it on the slate. Indigo is a hard substance, and you must grind it more thoroughly than the soft earth pigments, bearing down with the muller until the blue cake is reduced to a fine, dark powder. Then you add a pinch of the white chalk from the earthenware jar, mixing it into the indigo to lighten the colour, and you continue grinding until the two powders are completely blended. You add water and gum arabic solution from a small dropper bottle, working the mixture into a smooth, pale blue-grey liquid that resembles the colour of shallow seawater on an overcast day. You pour this wash into a second glazed dish and test it on the scrap of vellum. The colour is exactly right, a cool, muted blue that will indicate the areas where the water is thin enough for the bottom to be visible. You take up a clean brush, a smaller one with a finer point, and begin to paint the shallows that you earlier marked with stippled dots. The blue-grey wash flows into the stippled areas and just beyond them, creating a soft border that fades gradually into the white of the deeper sea. You paint the shallows around the estuary mouth, the thin water over the sandbar, and the scattered shoals along the open coast, and each patch of colour is laid on with the same steady, patient hand. The marshlands behind the dunes call for a different colour, and you prepare a pale moss green by mixing the green earth with a touch of burnt sienna and a generous amount of water. The green earth is a soft, muted pigment, and it grinds easily on the slate, releasing a colour that reminds you of dried sage leaves. You test the wash, adjust it with a few more drops of water to thin it further, and then apply it to the areas behind the sandy stretches of the coast. The green is so faint that it barely tints the vellum, a whisper of colour that suggests reeds and cordgrass and the still, brackish pools of the marsh. You paint it in small, irregular patches, following the pencil guidelines you drew from Santangle's descriptions, and you let each patch dry before adding any more. The work of colouring is slow and repetitive, and it fills the afternoon with a rhythm of preparation, application, and drying. You grind pigments, mix washes, test colours on the scrap of vellum, and then carry the brush to the chart with the same focused calm that you brought to the ink lines. The colours are all pale and muted, the hues of a landscape seen through a gentle haze, and they never overwhelm the inkwork beneath them. The chart remains first and foremost a navigational tool, and the colour is there only to clarify and to aid the eye, never to distract. At one point you rise to open the window a crack, because the air in the workshop has grown warm and still from the lamp and your own slow breathing. The window resists at first, its frame swollen by the humidity of the morning, but you press it with a steady pressure until it gives way with a soft wooden sound. A narrow gap opens, and through it comes a thread of outside air, cool and faintly salty, carrying with it the distant sound of a bell. The bell marks the hour, a single deep note that hangs in the air for a long moment and then fades into the rustle of the plane tree. You stand by the window and breathe the fresh air, looking down at the empty courtyard, where the cat has returned and is now washing her face on the warm stone. After a minute you return to the table, leaving the window open just enough to let the air circulate. You prepare the next wash, a very thin solution of carbon black that will serve to add subtle shadows to the cliff faces and the steep headlands. The carbon powder is so fine that it puffs up in a small dark cloud when you open the vial, and you handle it with care, pouring a tiny amount onto the slate and grinding it with the muller until it forms a smooth paste. You add water drop by drop, diluting the black into a pale grey that is barely darker than the vellum itself. With a very fine brush, you paint this grey wash along the western side of the headlands where Santignol noted that the cliffs were steep and shadowed, and the effect is almost imperceptible, a faint suggestion of depth that makes the headlands stand out from the surrounding shore. The afternoon light has begun to change. The north windows keep their steady grey illumination, but the quality of the light has shifted toward a softer, more golden tone as the sun moves lower in the sky. The lamp flame, which was almost invisible in the stronger morning light, now stands out more clearly, a small yellow point that reflects in the glass of the ink pot and the polished surface of the brass dividers. You adjust the wick slightly, lowering it to conserve oil, and then you return to the coloured washes. The last area to receive colour is the deep water beyond the soundings. Here you use a different blue, a slightly darker wash made from indigo with only a trace of chalk, and you paint it in a broad sweeping band along the outer edge of the chart. The blue fades inward toward the shore, growing lighter and lighter until it merges with the pale blue-grey of the shallows, and you achieve this fading by adding more water to the brush with each successive stroke, diluting the wash as you go. The result is a gentle gradient, a transition from deep water to shallow that mimics the actual slope of the seabed. The deep blue is the colour of the open ocean, the water that a ship crosses before it sights land, and its presence on the chart completes the marriage of land and sea. When the last wash has been laid on and the last patch of colour is dried, you set the brush aside and look at the chart as a whole. The ink lines stand dark and precise beneath their thin veils of colour, the hills rise in pale sienna behind the green-grey marshes, the shallows glow with a faint blue light, and the deep ocean holds a quiet, darker blue at the edges. The chart is still a practical instrument, but it is also a beautiful thing, a piece of careful craft that joins measurement to vision. You sit back on your stool, your hands folded in your lap, and you let the satisfaction of the work settle over you like the colours settling into the vellum. The bell has fallen silent, the courtyard is still, and the workshop holds its peace, waiting for the next quiet task. The chart now carries its coastline and soundings, its pale washes of sienna and blue-green, and the whole composition lies on the vellum like a landscape seen from a great height through a thin morning haze. But a map made for the use of ships is not complete until it offers the mariner a way to steer. The coastline tells him where the land lies, the soundings tell him how deep the water is, yet neither of these tells him how to set his course from one place to another. That task belongs to the rumlines, the radiating network of fine straight tracks that crisscross the sea and allow a pilot to align his compass with a known direction and hold it true across many leagues of open water. You are about to lay down these lines, and you begin by clearing a space on the table for the large brass compass and the protractor that have been waiting in their wooden case. The case is a long flat box of polished beech, and you open its brass clasp and lift the lid. Inside, the compass and protractor rest on a bed of dark blue felt, each instrument fitted into its own shaped hollow. You take out the compass first. It is a heavy instrument of polished brass with two straight legs joined at the top by a curved yoke, and one leg ends in a fine steel point while the other carries a small lead holder that can be tightened with a tiny brass screw. You open the legs and check the lead, which is a short cylinder of soft graphite, its tip worn to a slight angle from previous use. You loosen the screw, push the lead forward a fraction, and tighten it again, then test it on the scrap paper to be sure it makes a clean, dark line. The graphite leaves a smooth grey stroke, and you set the compass down on the table with its legs closed while you turn to the chart. The compass rose will sit in the lower right corner of the vellum, where the sea is open and free of soundings, and you have already marked the center point there with a tiny pencil dot that you placed when you were numbering the grid. You locate that dot now, touching it with the tip of your finger, and then you open the compass legs to a span of 3 finger widths, measuring the distance on the boxwood ruler. This span will give a rose of modest size, large enough to be read easily, but not so large that it dominates the chart. You place the steel point on the center dot, holding the compass by its yoke with your thumb and forefinger, and you lean forward slightly to bring your eye directly over the instrument. Then you rotate the compass smoothly, pressing the lead against the vellum with an even pressure, and the lead describes a perfect circle on the cream surface. The line is a pale grey, continuous and true, and when you lift the compass, you see that it meets itself exactly at the starting point, a closed ring with no visible join. Inside this outer circle you must draw a second, smaller circle that will form the inner ring of the compass rose. You close the legs of the compass by a small amount, checking the new span against the ruler until it is exactly 2.5 finger widths, and then you place the steel point on the same center dot and describe the second circle. This one sits neatly inside the first, and the space between them will hold the decoration and the labels. Finally, you draw a third, still smaller circle at the very center, a little ring that will contain the central boss of the rose, and you set the compass aside. Now you take up the protractor, a flat semicircle of brass with degree marks incised along its curved edge, and a small notch at the center of its straight base. The protractor is cool to the touch and heavier than it looks, and you align its straight edge with the center dot, so that the notch sits exactly over the point and the 0-degree marked points due north along one of the silver grid lines. You hold the protractor steady with your left hand while you use your right to pick up a sharpened lead point. Then, with the lead, you make a tiny tick mark on the outer circle at every point where a degree line on the protractor intersects the brass edge. You do not mark all 360 degrees. You mark only the 32 points of the mariner's compass, the directions that a pilot can actually steer. The first mark goes at north, at 0 degrees, and then you rotate the protractor slightly, aligning it with each successive point, north by east, north-northeast, north-northeast, northeast, and north, and northeast, and so on, around the entire circle. The work is repetitive and precise, and you count the points under your breath as you go, checking each one against the silver grid lines to be certain that no error has crept in. When you have marked all 32 points on the outer circle, you repeat the process on the middle circle, placing a smaller tick mark exactly in line with each outer mark so that the two sets correspond. The tick marks are the skeleton of the rose, and now you will connect them to create the star that gives the compass rose its name. You take up a fine quill and the pot of iron gall ink, and you begin to draw the lines that will radiate outward from the center. The principal points come first: north, south, east, and west. You align the ruler from the center dot to the north tick on the outer circle, and you draw a clean, straight line, pressing a little more firmly than usual, so that the line is slightly thicker than the others will be. The north line is the most important direction on any chart, the fixed reference from which all other bearings are taken, and you give it a small ornamental triangle at its outer end, a simple arrowhead that points toward the top of the sheet. You draw the south line in the same way, extending it from the center down to the southern tick, and then you draw the east and west lines, checking with the boxwood ruler that they are perfectly perpendicular to the north-south axis. The half winds come next: northeast, southeast, southwest, and northwest. These lines are drawn with a slightly lighter pressure, so that they are thinner than the cardinal directions but still prominent. You align the ruler carefully for each one, making sure it passes through both the center dot and the correct tick mark, and you draw the lines with the same steady motion that you used for the coast. The ink goes down in a fine dark stroke, and you lift the quill cleanly at the outer circle so that no stray mark extends beyond the boundary. Then you move to the quarter winds: north-northeast, east-northeast, east-southeast, and all the rest, a total of 8 lines that fill the spaces between the cardinals and the half winds. These you draw with an even finer pen, a crow quill that produces a hairline stroke, delicate but still visible. The lines extend only from the center to the middle circle, not to the outer one, so that the star of the compass rose acquires a layered appearance, the longest and thickest lines representing the cardinals, the middle-length ones the half winds, and the shortest the quarter winds. The effect is of a flower with many petals, a geometric bloom that spreads across the lower corner of the chart. With the star complete, you turn your attention to the decoration of the rose. The space between the inner and middle circles is wide enough to hold a pattern, and you begin to fill it with a series of small, evenly spaced triangles that point alternately inward and outward. Each triangle is drawn with a fine crow quill, its sides straight and its apex sharp, and you place them one after another, working your way around the circle in a slow, patient circuit. The triangles are all the same size, all the same shape, and the repetition of the pattern is soothing, a quiet exercise in hand and eye that requires no thought beyond the immediate moment. The ink dries quickly, and as you work, the rose becomes more ornate, a small piece of craftsmanship that will please any pilot who spreads the chart on his table. Now you must add color to the principal directions, as the style of the imperial chart house requires. You prepare 2 small washes, a pale sepia made from the burnt sienna with a touch of carbon black to deepen it, and a soft indigo blue made from the same indigo you used for the deep sea. You stir each wash until it's perfectly smooth, and you test them on the scrap of vellum. The sepia is a warm dark brown, the indigo a cool, muted blue, and together they will distinguish the cardinals from the other lines. You take up a fine brush and paint the north line with the sepia, tracing carefully over the ink so that the color lies exactly on top of the black line without straying onto the vellum around it. The sepia soaks into the line and darkens it to a rich brown, and when it is dry, you paint the south line in the same way. The east and west lines you paint with the indigo, and the blue gives them a quiet prominence that contrasts with the brown of the north-south axis. The half winds and quarter winds you leave in plain black ink, so that the colored lines stand out, and the pilot's eye can find them instantly. The coloring done, you turn to the final and most delicate task, the writing of the wind names. Each of the 32 points has a traditional name, and you must write these names around the outside of the rose in a small italic script that matches the hand used on all the charts of the house. You take up the finest quill you possess, a needle-pointed crow feather that you keep only for lettering, and you dip it in the carbon ink, which is blacker and more permanent than the iron gall. You begin at the north point, and you write the word Tramontana in tiny, precise letters, each one formed with a careful stroke of the pen. The script is slanted and elegant, the letters no taller than a grain of rice, and you space them evenly around the curve of the outer circle. After Tramontana come the names of the other cardinals: Mezzogiorno for the south wind, Levante for the east, Poniente for the west. You write each one slowly, pausing often to wipe the nib and to check the spacing against the tick marks. The names go down in a ring of tiny dark letters, and they give the rows a voice, a quiet announcement of the directions they represent. Next come the half-winds: Greco for northeast, Sirocco for southeast, Lebeccio for southwest, Maestro for northwest. These names you write in a slightly smaller script, fitting them between the cardinal names, and you angle them so that they follow the curve of the circle without crowding. The quarter-wind names are even smaller, and you write them with the very tip of the quill, breathing slowly to keep your hand steady. Tramontana Greco, Greco Tramontana, Greco Levante, Levante Greco, and so on, a catalogue of compound names that sounds like a quiet poem when recited. You write each one in its proper place, turning the chart slightly as you go so that you are always writing from a comfortable angle, and the letters form a complete ring of text that encircles the star of the rose. The compass rose is finished, but the rum lines that will spread across the chart are only beginning. You set the rose aside to dry completely and turn your attention to the rest of the vellum. The rum lines are the navigational threads that connect the rose to every part of the chart, and they must be drawn with the same precision as the rose itself. You take up the long boxwood ruler and the fine quill, and you begin to extend lines outward from the center dot of the rose to the edges of the vellum in all 32 directions. Each line is a faint, straight track that crosses the sea, cuts through the coastline, and continues over the land without pause, because a rum line is an ideal direction, a path that exists only in the geometry of the chart and pays no attention to the physical obstacles of rock or reef. You draw the first line from the center dot northward, aligning the ruler carefully with the north tick mark, and then drawing the quill along its edge in a single, unbroken stroke that goes all the way to the top margin. The line is so thin that it barely darkens the vellum, a pale grey thread that will not distract from the coast or the soundings. You draw the south line next, extending it to the bottom margin, and then the east and west lines to the side margins. These 4 cardinal rum lines are the longest and the most important, and you make them just slightly more prominent than the others by pressing the quill a fraction harder. Then you draw the half-wind rum lines, the ones that run from the center dot to the northeast, southeast, southwest, and northwest edges of the chart. These lines are thinner than the cardinals, and you take care to keep them straight by aligning the ruler with both the center dot and the tick mark on the rose. The ruler is not long enough to span the entire chart, so you must move it in stages, first drawing the line from the center dot to the middle of the sheet, then realigning the ruler and continuing to the edge. Each realignment is a small exercise in precision, and you check the continuity of the line by sighting along it with one eye closed before you resume drawing. After the half-winds come the quarter-wind rum lines, and these are the most numerous of all. There are 8 of them in each quadrant, a total of 24 lines that radiate outward in a dense, orderly fan. You draw them one by one, moving around the compass rose in a slow circle, and each line is a thin, straight track that extends to the margin of the chart. The work is repetitive and calming, and your hand settles into a steady rhythm. Align the ruler, dip the quill, draw the line, lift the quill, realign the ruler, dip again. The sound of the quill against the vellum is a soft, continuous scratching, and the lines multiply under your hand like the threads of a great silent web. As you draw, the chart transforms. The rum lines crisscross the sea in a fine network, intersecting with each other at dozens of points, and the coastline and the soundings lie beneath them like a picture beneath a gauze veil. The lines are deliberately faint, so that they do not obscure the geography, but they are present everywhere, a navigational skeleton that gives the chart its purpose. A pilot who spreads this map on his cabin table will be able to place his parallel rulers along any rhumb line and transfer that direction to the compass rose, reading the course he must steer. The lines are the bridge between the abstract world of direction and the physical world of wind and water, and you draw them with the respect due to a tool that will guide ships safely to harbour. When the last quarter wind line has been drawn to the margin, you set down the quill and flex your fingers, which have grown slightly stiff from the long period of fine work. You stand up, stretch your arms, and walk to the window. The courtyard below is now in shadow, the sun having moved far enough that the high wall of the east wing blocks its direct light. The plane tree stands dark against the pale sky, and the baker's cat is nowhere to be seen. The air coming through the open crack of the window is cooler now, carrying the first hint of evening, and you breathe it in deeply before returning to the table. There is one more task, the tiny decorative details that finish the compass rose. You take up the brush and the sepia wash again, and you paint a small, neat border around the outer circle of the rose, a thin band of warm brown that frames the whole construction. Then you add a touch of indigo to the tips of the cardinal triangles, tiny blue points that echo the colour of the east-west lines. These details are not necessary for navigation, but they are part of the tradition of the chart house, the small flourishes that distinguish a professional chart from a mere sketch. You work on them slowly, with the same care that you have given to every other part of the map, and when they are done, you set the brush aside and look at the completed rose. It sits in the lower right corner of the vellum, a delicate star of ink and colour, surrounded by its ring of wind names, and from it the rhumb lines spread outward across the sea and the land like the rays of a pale sun. The chart is now fully equipped for the navigator's use, and all that remains is the final task of duplication and preservation, which will occupy the closing hours of the day. You wipe your hands on the rag, close the inkpot, and sit quietly for a moment, letting your eyes rest on the work that has grown under your hands since the first grey light of morning. The original chart lies before you, its ink lines dry, and its washes settled into the vellum. The compass rose gleaming softly in the lower corner, with its ring of wind names and its radiating rhumb lines. The light from the north window has begun to fade, not into darkness but into a deeper grey, the slow dimming of a late afternoon that has slipped by while you were bent over your work. You do not need to look outside to know that the sun has dropped behind the hills. The quality of the air in the workshop tells you, a cooler weight that settles on your shoulders and makes the lamp flame appear brighter by contrast. You reach over and turn the wick up slightly, and the circle of warm light on the tabletop expands, pushing the shadows back toward the shelves and the distant corners of the room. The chart must now be preserved in duplicate, because a secret coastline drawn only once is a secret that can be lost to fire, to water, to the slow attrition of time and handling. You rise from your stool and go to a flat drawer built into the bottom of the large cabinet, a drawer lined with sheets of clean paper and containing the thin tracing paper that the chart house buys from a papermaker in the northern province. You lift the brass handle and slide the drawer open, and the tracing paper rustles softly, a sound like dry leaves stirred by a breath of wind. The paper is a pale, translucent substance made from cotton rag, beaten to a fine pulp and pressed into sheets so thin that you can read a written page through them. You take out a single sheet, holding it by its edges so that your fingers do not mark the surface, and you carry it back to the table, where you lay it gently over the original chart. The tracing paper settles onto the vellum with a slight drift, floating on the air cushion trapped beneath it, and you smooth it down with the flat of your hand, working from the center outward to chase away any wrinkles or bubbles. The paper is so thin that the coastline beneath it appears as a grey ghost, every inlet and cape and sounding visible, but softened, as if seen through a thin veil of water. The rhumb lines show through as faint threads, and the compass rose is a pale mandala of circles and triangles waiting to be captured. You choose a soft pencil for this task, a graphite stick wrapped in string that leaves a darker mark than the hard lead point you used for the grid. You pick it up and test it on the scrap paper, drawing a short curve and then a straight line, and the graphite glides smoothly, leaving a dense grey track that will transfer well to the new vellum. You settle yourself on the stool, adjusting your position so that the lamplight falls directly on the tracing paper without casting your own shadow across the work, and you begin. The first line you trace is the coastline itself, because the coastline is the heart of the chart and everything else depends upon it. You place the pencil point at the upper left corner of the tracing paper, exactly above the place where the ink line begins on the original, and you draw slowly, following the curve of the shore with the same motion that you used when you first inked it. The pencil makes a soft, smooth sound on the paper, a gentle rubbing that is quieter than the scratch of a quill, and the line appears as a dark grey ribbon that copies every bend and turn of the original with perfect fidelity. You move your hand at a steady pace, neither rushing nor hesitating, and you watch the line through the translucent paper, checking constantly that the pencil mark lies exactly on top of the ink beneath. Where the coast forms a deep inlet, you slow down and follow the indentation with a careful rotation of your wrist. Where the shore straightens into the long sandy reach, you draw a long, unbroken stroke, holding the pencil at a consistent angle to keep the line width even. The tracing of the soundings comes next, and this is the most painstaking part of the copy. Each tiny numeral must be reproduced exactly, and the enclosing circles must be round and true. You work from north to south, just as you did when you placed the soundings originally, and you trace every number with the very tip of the pencil, forming each digit with a deliberate, miniature motion. The pencil point is sharp and you sharpen it often on a small block of sandpaper that you keep beside the lamp, twisting the graphite against the abrasive surface until it comes to a fine cone. A blunt pencil would make the numbers fat and illegible, and so you pause frequently to restore the point, turning the pencil in your fingers and checking the tip against the light. The rhythm of tracing is different from the rhythm of original drawing. It is a rhythm of following rather than creating, of allowing the existing lines to guide your hand. You feel the shape of the coast through the paper, a subtle topography of ink and vellum that rises to meet the pencil, and you let your hand respond to that feeling with the same quiet patience that has attended every stage of the work. When you have traced all the soundings along the open coast, you move inland and trace the symbols and labels, the tiny anchors, the dotted shoals, the broken line of the sandbar, the asterisks of the rocks awash. Each symbol is a small test of precision, and you meet each one with the same calm attention. The pencil reproduces them as a series of soft grey marks, slightly darker than the silver stylus lines of the grid, but still discreet, still subordinate to the ink that will eventually cover them. The tracing of the compass rose is a chapter within a chapter, a long and intricate task that fills the center of the afternoon. The rose contains many elements: the 3 concentric circles, the 32 radiating lines, the tiny triangles of the decoration, and the ring of wind names written in their minuscule italic script. You begin at the outer circle, tracing it with a smooth, continuous motion that requires you to rotate the paper slightly as you go, so that your hand can maintain a comfortable angle. The inner circles follow, and then you turn to the star of rhumb lines, tracing each one from the center dot outward to its tick mark. The principal lines are the thickest, and you press a little harder with the pencil to indicate their importance. The half winds are thinner, and the quarter winds are faint, just as they are on the original, and you reproduce these gradations of line weight by varying the pressure of your hand, a subtle adjustment that has become second nature over years of practice. The wind names are the final detail of the rose, and you trace each one with the very point of the pencil, forming the letters with tiny, careful strokes. The names are so small that you must lean close to the paper, and a lamplight warms your cheek as you work. Tramontana, Mezzogiorno, Levante, Poniente, Greco, Sirocco, Lebeccio, Maestro, and all the compound names of the quarter winds, you trace them all, letter by letter, and the pencil renders them as faint grey words that will later be inked over and become permanent. The tracing of the rose takes a long time, and when you finally set the pencil down and stretch your fingers, you see that the lamp has become the main source of light in the room, the north window now showing only a dim, pearly rectangle of fading daylight. You lift the tracing paper carefully, peeling it back from the original chart with both hands, and you hold it up to the lamp to examine the transfer. The light shines through the thin paper, and the pencil lines show as a complete, ghostly replica of the map, every detail present and accounted for. You look for gaps or omissions, scanning the coastline, the soundings, the run lines, and the rows with a slow, methodical eye. You find a small place where the pencil line of the coast has grown faint, a stretch of no more than a finger's width, and you lay the paper down again and darken that line with a few careful strokes. You also check the numbers of the soundings, comparing a few of them at random against the original, and each one is correct. The trace is true. Now you set the tracing paper aside on a clean portion of the table, weighting down its corners with the brass dividers and the bone folder, so that it will not curl, and you go to the drawer where the blank vellum is stored. The vellum for the copy is a fresh sheet, already sized and stretched on its own wooden frame, and you lift it out and carry it back to the table. The surface is smooth and pale, slightly lighter in color than the original, because it has never been handled or exposed to the air, and it gives off the clean, faintly sweet scent of new calf skin. You unclip the frame and free the sheet, laying it in the clear space beside the original chart, and you pin its corners down with the same brass pins that you used before, pressing them into the oak tabletop with a firm push of your thumb. The copy will be made by transferring the pencil trace to this new vellum, and then inking over the transferred lines, a process that saves time and ensures an exact duplicate. You take a sheet of soft, unglazed paper and place it over the new vellum, smoothing it flat. Then you take the tracing paper and lay it face down on top of the soft paper so that the pencil lines are in contact with the surface. You take a polished bone folder, the same one you used earlier to burnish the original vellum, and you begin to rub the back of the tracing paper with a firm, even pressure, transferring the graphite onto the new vellum by means of the soft paper beneath. The rubbing makes a soft, rhythmic sound, a gentle swish that fills the quiet workshop, and you work in small sections, lifting the tracing paper periodically to check that the lines are transferring cleanly. The graphite appears on the new vellum as a faint grey mirror of the original, a pale duplicate that will guide your inking. When the entire trace has been transferred, you remove the tracing paper and the soft paper, and you set them aside. The new vellum now carries a pale grey copy of the chart, every line and number present but faint, like a memory that has not yet been sharpened by attention. You take up a fresh quill, a grey goose feather that you cut only yesterday, and you open the pot of iron gall ink, stirring it with the glass rod as you did in the morning. The ink is darker now, having been exposed to the air and stirred several times, and it flows readily from the quill when you dip the nib. You begin to ink the copy, starting with the coastline, and you trace over the pale pencil lines with the same steady hand that drew the original. The ink goes down in a dark, permanent line, covering the graphite and bonding with the vellum, and the duplicate coastline emerges from the grey ghost of the trace as a solid, confident shape. The inking of the copy takes the same care as the original, because a duplicate is not a lesser thing, but an equal partner in the task of preservation. You draw the inlets and capes, the sandy spit and the rocky island, the river mouth and the long cliff, and you add the soundings one by one, writing each number with its enclosing circle. You draw the run lines from the compass rose outward, extending them to the margins with the ruler and the fine quill, and you ink the rose itself, darkening the circles and the triangles and the wind names until they stand as clear and sharp as those on the original. The colors cannot be duplicated in this session. The washes will be applied later, perhaps tomorrow, by another hand or by your own. But for now the line work is sufficient for the archive. A chart in pure ink is still a complete chart, and the colors are an enhancement that can wait. The workshop has grown fully dark beyond the circle of the lamp, and the quiet has deepened into the particular stillness of evening. You are alone in the long room, the other tables empty, the shelves receding into shadow, and the only sounds are the tiny hiss of the lamp, the scratch of the quill, and the occasional creak of the old timbers settling as the night coolness seeps into the walls. You work more slowly now, because your hand is tired, but the tiredness is of the pleasant kind, a gentle heaviness in the wrist and forearm that comes from a day of concentrated effort. You pause often to rest, to flex your fingers, to look at the copy and compare it to the original, and each time you see that the two charts are becoming twins, two versions of the same coastline, two records of the same secret. When the last run line has been inked and the last sounding has been circled, you set down the quill and wipe the nib clean on the rag. You stand up, your legs slightly stiff from sitting, and you lift the copy with both hands, holding it at arm's length beside the original. The two charts lie side by side in the lamplight, and they are nearly identical. The same coastline traced and inked by the same hand, the same numbers and symbols, the same compass rose with its ring of names. There are tiny differences, a slight variation in the weight of a line here, or a faint unevenness in a circle there, but these are the fingerprints of the handmade, the small proofs that a human being sat and drew each line with attention and care. A navigator given either chart would find his way safely, and that is the purpose that justifies the labor. You lay the copy down on the table to dry, and you tidy the workspace with slow, habitual movements. The quills are wiped clean and returned to their silk pad. The inkpot is sealed with fresh wax, melted from a small stick held over the lamp flame and dripped onto the cork. The dividers are closed and set in their case. The ruler is wiped free of graphite dust. The tracing paper is folded and returned to the drawer, and the scrap paper with its notes is gathered and placed in a small basket for later disposal. The original chart is left on the table, still pinned, because it will be rolled and boxed in the morning when the ink of the copy has fully dried and the final inspection has been made. You walk to the window and look out into the courtyard, which is now a well of deep shadow, with only a faint glow from the baker's window across the street. The plane tree is a dark shape against the darker sky, and the first stars are beginning to appear above the roof of the east wing. The air coming through the crack of the window is cool and smells of the sea, and you stand there for a little while, letting the quiet of the evening settle over you. Then you close the window, fasten the latch, and return to the table. The lamp is burning low, its oil reservoir nearly empty, and you lower the wick until the flame shrinks to a small blue point, just enough light to navigate the stairs. You pick up the copy chart, handling it with the gentleness of long practice, and you carry it to the drying rack that stands near the cabinet, a tall wooden frame with horizontal bars where finished charts are hung to cure. You lay the copy over one of the bars, making sure it is flat and uncreased, and you leave it there in the darkness with the other charts that are waiting for their colors and their final boxes. The workshop is now almost entirely dark, and you are ready to climb the stairs to your chamber. But before you go, you pause at the table and look down at the original chart, still pinned under its brass corners. The lamplight catches the ink lines and the pale washes, the compass rose glowing softly in the corner, the coast running from north to south with its capes and inlets and its careful soundings. It is a good chart, a true chart, and it will serve the ships that carry it. You touch the vellum once, very lightly, with the tip of your finger, and then you turn away, leaving the original where it lies, ready for the archivist's shelf in the morning. The stairs creak softly under your feet as you ascend, and the small blue flame of the lamp guides you upward into the quiet dark. The lamp burns low on the table, its flame a small blue teardrop that wavers gently each time you move through the room, and you know that the day's work has reached its final hour. You stand at the foot of the stairs for a moment, holding the lamp in one hand and looking back across the workshop, where the original chart still lies pinned under its brass corners, and the copy rests on the drying rack like a pale ghost in the shadows. The long room is quiet, its shelves and tables receding into the darkness beyond the small circle of your light, and the air carries the cool, clean smell of the evening seeping in through the old stone walls. You breathe in that coolness, and let it settle into your lungs, feeling the pleasant tiredness that has been gathering in your muscles since the early morning when you first descended these same stairs with the grey light on your face. You walk slowly back to your table, the lamp held before you so that its light falls on the flagstones and shows you the familiar path between the oak tables and the racks of quills. At the table you set the lamp down and turn up the wick just enough to give yourself a working light, a warm pool of amber that illuminates the tools and the chart and the scattered remnants of the day's labor. The first thing you do is pick up the quills from their silk pad. There are 4 of them now, the broad quill you used for the coastline, the fine crow quill for the soundings, the needle-pointed lettering quill for the wind names, and the fresh goose quill you cut for the duplicate. Each one has served you through the long hours, and each one must be cleaned before it can be put away. You take the small jar of water that you used earlier for the pigment washes, now half empty and slightly cloudy with traces of color, and you dip the first quill into it, swishing the nib gently back and forth. The water loosens the dried ink from the slit and the underside of the point, and dark threads of dissolved iron gall curl into the water like smoke. You wipe the nib carefully on the soft rag, drawing it through the folded cloth several times until no more color comes off, and then you hold it to the lamp to check that the slit is clear and the tines are undamaged. One by one you clean all 4 quills in the same way, working slowly and without hurry, and when they are all clean and dry, you lay them back on the silk pad in a neat row, their nibs aligned, ready for the next day or the next chart that will be drawn at this table. Next you turn to the inkpot. The iron gall ink has been used steadily throughout the day, and the level in the pot has dropped by perhaps a finger's width. You take up the small wax stick and the brass spoon that you keep for sealing, and you hold the spoon over the lamp flame until it warms, then drop a piece of wax into it. The wax melts quickly, releasing a faint honey scent, and you pour the liquid wax over the cork stopper of the ink pot, tilting the pot slightly so that the wax runs around the seam and forms a complete seal. You press the chart house seal into the warm wax while it is still soft, the small brass die leaving the imprint of a compass rose in the dark brown surface, and then you set the pot aside on the shelf where it will wait undisturbed until the next time it is needed. The carbon ink pot is smaller and still nearly full, and you seal it in the same way, using a smaller die that fits the narrow neck of its glass vial. The oyster shell that served as your dipping well now holds only a shallow residue of dried ink, a dark stain that has sunk into the porous inner surface. You carry the shell to the pantry and rinse it under the small tap of water that draws from the cistern on the roof, scrubbing it gently with your fingertip until the water runs clear. The shell will never be entirely clean again, but the deep stain is a part of its usefulness, a record of the many times it has held ink for your quills. You shake the water from it and set it upside down on a cloth to drain, then return to the table. The brushes come next. The broad squirrel brush that laid the sienna wash on the hills, the fine blue-grey brush for the shallows, and the tiny detail brush for the compass rose decoration all lie in a row beside the pigment dishes. You rinse each one in the water jar, working the bristles gently with your fingers to release the pigment that has dried at the base. The water turns a murky brown, then a pale blue, then clear again as the last traces of color leave the brushes. You shape the bristles with your damp fingers, pulling them to a fine point or a flat edge as each brush requires, and you lay them flat on a clean rag to dry, away from the heat of the lamp so that the bristles will not curl. The pigment dishes themselves are small glazed bowls, each one holding the remains of a wash that has now dried to a powdery film. The burnt sienna has left a warm, rust-colored ring at the bottom of its dish, the indigo blue a pale grey crust, the green earth a faint dust, the color of dried sage. You stack the dishes together and set them beside the water jar to be washed properly tomorrow when the daylight returns. The larger earthenware jar of chalk you recork and return to the cabinet, along with the wooden box of indigo and the folded paper of green earth. You wipe the slate grinding slab with a damp cloth, removing the faint halos of pigment that have dried around the edges, and you dry the glass molar and set it back in its felt-lined drawer. The cabinet doors close with their familiar soft sound, and you turn the brass key in the lock, feeling the wards click into place. Now you gather the sea journals that you consulted earlier. The Journal of Santangle is still on the corner of the table where you left it after tracing the soundings, its salt-stained cover a dark shape against the oak. You pick it up and hold it for a moment, feeling the roughness of that damaged leather under your palm, and then you carry it to the large cabinet against the wall. You open the door, slide the journal back into its place on the shelf between the Costa de Algarve and the Islas Afortunadas, and you close the door firmly. The other journal, the smaller logbook that you used for checking the latitude figures, goes back beside it, and you check that all the volumes on the shelf are upright and properly aligned before you lock the cabinet and remove the key. The key goes onto the ring at your belt, where it clinks softly against the other keys that you carry, the one for the pigment cabinet and the one for the vellum drawer, and the small one for the archivist's box. The scrap paper with your pencil notes has served its purpose, and you gather the sheets from the corner of the table, stacking them together and folding them once. Some mapmakers burn their notes at the end of a project, but you prefer to keep them for a time in case a question arises about a sounding or a bearing, and so you carry the folded papers to a small wooden box on the shelf beside the cabinet, a box labeled Notas de Trabalho, and you slip them inside with the notes from other charts, other coasts, other quiet days of measurement and drawing. The box lid closes with a soft thud, and the notes settle into the darkness among their companions. The tabletop is almost clear now. The tools that remain, the dividers, the ruler, the steel straight edge, the bone folder, are wiped clean with the rag and returned to their proper places in the shallow wooden tray that slides into a slot beneath the table. You wipe the tabletop itself with a damp cloth, removing the faint smudges of graphite and the ghostly fingerprints that have accumulated over the hours, and the oak comes up dark and smooth, its grain shining in the lamplight. The small pile of used rag pieces you gather and drop into the scrap basket, and the water jar is emptied into the slop bucket in the pantry, rinsed and set upside down on the stone shelf to dry. Now at last you turn to the original chart, still pinned to the table under its 4 brass pins. The chart is dry, its ink lines hard and permanent, its washes settled into the vellum with a soft, matte finish. The compass rose glows in the lower corner, its sepia and indigo lines catching the lamplight, and the coastline runs from north to south with all its inlets and capes and soundings complete. You stand over it for a long moment, looking at the whole composition, tracing the familiar line of the shore with your eyes. It is a good chart, a true chart, a piece of careful work that has taken all your skill and patience. You nod once to yourself, a small gesture of completion, and then you lean forward and begin to remove the pins. Each pin comes out with a gentle pull, its brass head cool between your fingers, and you set them one by one in a small dish on the shelf. The vellum lifts free of the table, its edges curling slightly now that the tension of the pins is released, and you handle it with the same gentleness you would use for a sleeping child. You lay the sheet flat on a clean portion of the table and roll it slowly from the bottom upward, using your fingers to keep the roll tight and even. The vellum resists slightly at first, its size surface stiff and springy, but it soon yields and forms a compact cylinder no thicker than your wrist. You hold the roll in your left hand while you reach for a linen sleeve from the drawer beneath the table, a long tube of unbleached cloth that has been sewn to the exact dimensions of a standard chart. You slide the rolled vellum into the sleeve, tucking the open end under so that no dust can enter, and then you tie a length of linen tape around the middle of the sleeve, knotting it twice with a neat bow. The sleeve chart goes into one of the long wooden boxes that wait on a shelf near the drying rack. These boxes are made of cedar, their wood pale and fragrant, and their lids fit snugly onto their bases with a soft, sliding pressure. You lift one of the boxes down and set it on the table, remove the lid, and lay the sleeve chart inside. The box is lined with a thin sheet of raw cotton to cushion the vellum, and you tuck the ends of the cotton over the chart before you replace the lid. On the outside of the box, already burned into the cedar by a heated brand, is the chart house mark and a space for the date and the name of the coast. You take up a soft pencil and write the date in the space provided, along with the name Costa Occidental, Santangle, 1553, in your small, clear hand. The pencil marks are faint but legible, and they will be replaced later by a formal ink inscription done by the archivist's assistant. For now, the pencil is enough to identify the box and its contents. The copy chart is still on the drying rack, its ink fully dry but its vellum still slightly tacky from the fresh inking. You lift it carefully from the bar, holding it by the edges, and you lay it flat on the table to inspect it one more time. The lines are clean and sharp, the soundings correct, the run lines straight and true. It is a faithful duplicate, and it will serve as the archive's backup, the copy that is never taken to sea but remains safe in the chart house vaults. You roll this chart as well, more gently even than the original, because the ink is newer and more vulnerable to smudging, and you slip it into its own linen sleeve and tie it with tape. This copy goes into a second cedar box, and you write Copia on the lid in pencil, along with the same date and name. The two boxes sit side by side on the table, their cedar scent mingling with the faint smell of ink and old paper that permeates the workshop. You pick them up, one under each arm, and you carry them slowly through the long room toward the corridor that leads to the archivist's door. The corridor is narrow and unlit, but you know its length and its turns by heart, and you walk it carefully, your footsteps echoing softly on the flagstones. The archivist's door is at the end of the corridor, a heavy oak door with iron studs and a small sliding panel at eye height. You do not knock loudly. You rap twice with your knuckle, a quiet tap that is the signal used by all the mapmakers when they deliver a finished chart. There is no answer, because the archivist has gone home for the evening, and you do not expect one. You set the two boxes down on the stone shelf beside the door, where a row of other boxes already waits, and you check that the labels face outward so that the archivist can read them easily in the morning. Then you turn and walk back along the corridor, your arms empty now, your steps lighter. Back in the workshop you make a final circuit of the room. You check that the lamp on your table is still burning safely, its flame low and steady. You check that the pigment cabinet is locked, that the quill rack is full and orderly, that the window is latched and the shutters are closed against the night air. You walk past the other tables, the ones belonging to your fellow mapmakers, and you see that they have left their works in progress neatly covered with cloths, their tools put away, their stools pushed under the tables. Everything is as it should be. The workshop is a place of order, and you leave it in order, a quiet space waiting for the morning. You pick up the lamp from your table and carry it to the foot of the stairs. The staircase rises before you, its wooden treads steep and narrow, and you begin to climb slowly, one step at a time, your left hand trailing along the cool plaster wall. Each tread gives its familiar small creak under your weight, a series of soft notes that rise in pitch as you go higher, and the lamplight throws a shifting shadow on the wall beside you. The climb is not long, but you take it slowly, feeling the tiredness in your legs and the pleasant ache in your shoulders from the long hours of leaning over the table. At the top of the stairs you step into the narrow corridor that leads to your chamber, and you walk past the closed doors of the other rooms, each one silent and dark. Your own door is at the end of the corridor, and you lift the iron latch and push it open. The room is exactly as you left it in the morning. The bed with its wool blanket, the washstand with its clay basin and pitcher, the wooden chest with the iron hinges, the stool with the woven rush seat. The small window shows a rectangle of deep blue sky, and through the thick greenish glass you can see the first bright stars. You set the lamp on the washstand and turn to close the door, dropping the latch into place with a soft clink. Then you stand still for a moment in the center of the room, breathing the cool air and letting the silence of the night gather around you. You undress slowly, in the same unhurried way that you dressed in the morning. The jerkin is unbuttoned and hung on the nail beside the door. The shirt is pulled over your head and folded loosely on the stool. The breeches are untied and stepped out of, the stockings rolled down and placed with the shoes beside the chest. You stand for a moment in your bare skin, feeling the cool air on your arms and legs, and then you take a clean nightshirt from the chest and pull it over your head, the soft linen falling around your knees. The nightshirt smells faintly of rosemary, the same herb that scented the washing water, and the smell is a quiet comfort. At the washstands you pour fresh water from the pitcher into the basin, and you wash your face and hands one more time, scrubbing away the last traces of graphite and ink that have clung to your fingers. The water is cool and clean, and you splash it gently over your closed eyes, feeling the day's small grit wash away. You dry your face on the linen cloth, fold it, and hang it back on its peg. Then you take up the lamp, hold it close to your lips, and blow a single soft breath across the top of the glass chimney. The flame wavers, bends, and goes out with a thin wisp of smoke that smells of warm oil and burnt wick. The room falls into darkness, and you set the lamp on the washstand, where it will cool and be ready for tomorrow. You cross the room in the dark, your bare feet finding the familiar path around the creaking board, and you reach the bed. You pull back the wool blanket, feeling its rough warmth under your hands, and you lie down on the mattress, which is stuffed with straw and crunches softly as you settle your weight onto it. You pull the blanket up to your chin and turn onto your side, facing the window, where the stars glimmer through the thick glass. Your body feels heavy and relaxed, sinking into the mattress, and you let your breathing slow into a deep, even rhythm. The sounds of the night drift through the walls, the distant, rhythmic hush of the sea breathing against the harbour wall, the faint creak of the plane tree in the courtyard as the night breeze stirs its branches, the far-off cry of a gull. These sounds are soft and continuous, and they wrap around you like a second blanket. You think without effort of the chart that now sits in its cedar box on the archivist's shelf, a hidden coastline safely drawn and ready for the ships that will carry it across the waters, and you think of the copy that rests beside it, the twin that will stay safe in the vault, preserving the secret for another generation. These thoughts are not sharp or urgent, they are simply present, small quiet facts that drift through your mind like leaves on a slow stream. Your eyelids grow heavy, and you let them close. The stars behind the window continue to shine. The sea continues its distant murmur, and the plane tree rustles softly in the dark. The room around you is still and cool, and the day's work is complete. You feel the weight of the blanket on your shoulder, the roughness of the straw mattress beneath you, and the slow, steady beat of your own heart. And then even these sensations begin to fade, dissolving into the gentle darkness that rises up to meet you. Sleep comes not as a sudden fall, but as a gradual deepening, a slow drift into quietness, and the last thing you know before awareness slips away is the calm knowledge that the coast is drawn, the map is safe, and all is well.